Hey, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, George, for taking the time for what I'm sure is yet another Zoom event for you. For anyone who needs an introduction to George Packer, he's a staff writer at The Atlantic, formerly a staff writer at The New Yorker magazine. He's the author of, most recently, Last Best Hope, American Crisis and Renewal, as well as Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, and Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq. And additionally, he's also written 2 novels, 2 memoirs, and as I mentioned, you can frequently find him in the pages of The Atlantic. So for today's salon, we sort of borrowed the title, Why I Write, from a very famous and seminal essay by George Orwell, who is a hero of both mine and George, and I'm sure many others of you. George has edited 2 very excellent selections of George Orwell's essays that came out a little over a decade ago, I think. And George, I remember that you've said at one point that that you read those great 4 volumes of Orwell's collected works at a fairly young age, I think in your early 20s. And I wondered if you, I'm assuming that Orwell was one of the reasons that you decided to write. And so I thought maybe you could begin by talking about perhaps his influence on your work, and to, maybe, although it's a very broad question, maybe answer the question, why it is that you write.
Well, thanks, Morten. Thank you, Anna, for having me to your famous salon, and thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We must be in many parts of the world, and Zoom is tiresome, but certain conversations on Zoom are wonderful, and I have a feeling this is going to be one of them. So actually, like every American high school student of my generation, I read 1984. And for some reason, it didn't make much impression on me in high school. I just didn't have the context for why it was an important book. It was weird. It did describe the world. I'm hearing somebody in the background, but it just was weird. It described a world I couldn't understand or imagine from my mellow Eagles soundtrack 1970s California teenage years. But a few years later, I was passing through Barcelona on my way back from a couple of very hard years as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa. And it was really about the lowest moment of my life. And I went into this English language bookstore and saw a copy of Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell, which seemed like the right book to find in Barcelona. So I bought the copy and I read it on the airplane home. And I can't really describe the effect this book had on me, but something about the clarity, the force, the honesty, the unpretension, and yet complexity with simplicity, I guess, is a way to describe Orwell. By the time we landed in JFK, I felt slightly better about my future. Like I had really been in a deep depression, and something about reading Homage to Catalonia showed me, like, not just how I could write, but how I could live. Not that I was about to go volunteer to fight in anybody's civil war, but to look at yourself as clearly and honestly as Orwell looks at himself, and yet not to get lost in yourself without looking, but instead to see your experience as taking you out of yourself to other people, to politics, to ideas, to the world. That was like, basically I discovered nonfiction writing with that book, because we didn't read nonfiction in high school or college. Literature was poetry, drama, and novels. And so my idea of being a writer was to write poetry or fiction. And I had been trying to do that throughout high school and college without great success. And Homage to Catalonia, and then the 4 volumes of collected essays, journalism, and letters, which I read in the next few years while I was working on construction crews and beginning to write my first book, which was about my years in West Africa. It became the model for how you could write about your own experience without solipsism, without losing yourself in yourself. And I mean, I really read those books hard, like the covers fell off, the pages fell apart. I got the rhythm of his sentences almost into my breathing. And I'm sure that some of my early writing is horribly imitative, but I think writers actually can learn by imitating writers they like and feel close to. So I did a lot of imitating of Orwell in my 20s and managed to get this book written called The Village of Waiting about the years I was in Africa. And that should have been the sign that I was going to become a nonfiction writer because of my false starts in fiction, but somehow I didn't get the message. And that's another story. But that was sort of, Orwell was like my Master's of Fine Arts program, my MFA. I didn't go to graduate school, but reading those 4 volumes Talmudically, like how do you put a sentence together? How do you put a paragraph together? How does an essay work? Where are the transitions? Where does the description give way to ideas? All of those things were I was teaching myself while I was reading Orwell.
Yeah, that's interesting because I mean, you already said it, but I mean, you did begin by writing at least one novel in your, I think, late 20s, and then another memoir and another novel in your 30s. And it interests me because I think it seems like a fairly unconventional way into nonfiction and into journalism. But at the same time, your nonfiction books, especially something like The Unwinding or Our Man, are unconventional nonfiction books in that they actually resemble novels in a certain way. And you, especially in Our Man, you have this very, an almost fictional character in the form of the narrator. And so I wonder if, I mean, you're dismissive of your early fictional efforts, but clearly it's had a huge influence on you. And I wonder if writing fiction first actually in some ways improved your later forays into nonfiction.
I think so. I mean, when you told me, Morten, that you were going to be reading my novels, it really alarmed me. I mean, I knew that your opinion of me was going to take a bit of a hit. So for me, the novel is sort of the ideal form. And I wrote 2. I guess they're not, I don't want to be too dismissive. I put a lot of effort into them. I learned a lot writing them. They didn't make any impression on the public. And after the second of those experiences, I realized I just can't, if I want to be a writer, I need readers. Writers need readers. They don't write in a void. They don't write for themselves. I need to find a way to write in order to reach readers. So maybe that's the first answer to why I write is to reach readers. And the fiction wasn't doing that, but the fiction was in a form that I love. I mean, I'm always reading novels, and I'm especially reading novels when I'm writing nonfiction. During the research phase of my books, I usually have to immerse myself in a lot of subject area literature and journalism and newspapers and magazines and history, et cetera. But once I sit down to write, I just want to have the best novels by me because I want the language, I want the feel of narrative, of how narrative works. I want that in my head. I don't want to have a lot of jargon or a lot of mediocre prose efforts that are, useful but not beautiful in my head. So when I was a kid and when I was a teenager, my favorite novelists were Conrad, Lawrence, um, and then a bit later, and Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Faulkner, and then a bit later, John Dos Passos. And in one way or another, all of those writers, I think, had an influence on my nonfiction. So I guess when I sit down to write a book of nonfiction, the ideal form in my head is a novel. And I'm always looking for a structure and a voice that give me the feeling of writing a novel with the security of a pile of research on the desk next to me, a bunch of notebooks, a bunch of transcripts of interviews, a bunch of research books. Those kind of give me the security that I'm not going to get lost in the blank page as I did for 10 years writing those two novels. They were very hard to write. They did not come naturally. That's a sign that that's not the form I should be working in. Nonfiction comes much more easily to me, partly because I have the solid building blocks. I have the bricks, the stones, which are facts. They give me a tremendous amount of confidence. My imagination doesn't give me confidence. But once I can start building from those bricks and stones, then my imagination can begin to come alive because it's built on something. And I guess that's, in a nutshell, why I became a nonfiction writer. It took me a long time to become a journalist. You mentioned that I'd written two memoirs. One was the book about Africa. The second was like a 3-generational family history of my grandfather, my father, myself, overlaid with the history of liberalism in the last century. Basically, we were a political family, and the book is about American history and politics through the story of the family. So that was a kind of memoir. I wasn't interested in journalism. To me, it wasn't literature. It wasn't the great stuff that I grew up wanting to write. It seemed like a sort of lower form. And we didn't read Janet Malcolm in high school or college. We didn't read John McPhee. We didn't read the great literary journalists. We didn't read Joan Didion, Norman Mailer, James Baldwin. They were not part of, we read Baldwin's fiction. So in a way, nonfiction hadn't yet been discovered, I guess, in the 70s and early 80s in the same way for kids in school. So I had to discover it on my own. And by the time I was about 40, I realized journalism was a way I could write good work and reach readers. But the struggle is always to make it journalism that's worth something and that might last, rather than just the ephemera of this week's issue or this month's issue, or even more ephemeral, this day's web piece. So I guess I'm always trying to hold on to that early idea that to sit down and write is to try to write something that will last and that will be beautiful and true, and not just provide information. And when I realized that journalism could do that, I gave myself to journalism, but I was pretty old by the time I figured all that out.
That's where I guess Orwell also serves as a kind of model, because he knew so well how to turn even a movie, some random film review, into something that says more than just, as you put it, the immediate, whether or not this movie is good, or whether or not this novel is good. It seems all of his criticism is speaking beyond just that immediate piece.
That's right. I mean, if you go through the 4 volumes that I was reading in my 20s, or the 2 volumes that I got to edit 10, 12 years ago, every one of these pieces, no matter how short, whether it's a newspaper column that was almost a blog, like an early blog that he wrote called As I Please, or a review of The Great Dictator, or a theater review, or longer book reviews, an essay on Charles Dickens, an essay on dirty postcards. They all have something that lasts, that connects beyond just the immediate moment and the immediate subject. And they're also so well written and lively and interesting that you just can pick them up today and immediately get absorbed. And I mean, that's a really high standard, and very few writers can meet that standard, but we should try. And that's, I guess that's the essay that we're talking about now. There's sort of two different ways of writing that have pretty much defined my work. One is narrative and the other is the essay. So you could say the novel and the essay. If you put them together, I think you get literary nonfiction. You get a combination of characters, scenes, stories, the novel, and thinking on the page, and generalizing and connecting ideas, and that's the essay.
I was rereading your introduction to the selections of Orwell's essays that you edited, and you have a great line where you say that in his best work, Orwell's arguments are mostly with himself, and I think that is actually one of the hallmarks of a great essay. And I wonder if you feel the same way about your work. If you often find yourself, and I actually think that it's very clear in your books, whether it's just shorter pieces or whether it's the longer works of narrative nonfiction, that you seem to be having a running argument with yourself very often. I mean,
I am constantly at odds with myself, divided about what to think, seeing merits on both sides or all sides. I mean, it may be a little bit of a weakness. I mean, I think of Hitchens and his work as someone who never stops to question himself. He's always winning the fight with someone else. And if you read a lot of him, that's exhausting and even a little tiresome, because you don't just want to watch the champ winning over and over and over again. You want there to be the quarrel with oneself that is poetry, rather than rhetoric. But sometimes too much of the quarrel with oneself is also frustrating. But it gets me into trouble, Morten. I mean, it means that, you know, I spent several pages in my Iraq book describing how hard it was for me to figure out what to think of the war beforehand, which I never took a public position on before the war. I just wrote some reported pieces, but I knew that privately I had to figure out what I thought. And I came down like on the side of, yes, we should do this by a fraction. And that confession later turned me into an architect of the Iraq War, according to people who didn't bother reading the book. And today we live in a time when it does not pay to argue with yourself. You know, you will be punished for showing the indecision or the weakness, or even the complexity that arguing with yourself produces, and that not having both a fixed position, a fixed ideology, and a fixed tribe, all of those things are protection. And I don't feel I have them. And for me, that's always been like a sign of strength. I've always valued not having that, but I feel more and more that it's dangerous today.
Glad you brought up the Iraq book, because I've just been rereading it. And I mean, it's so much more powerful and so much more critical of the war and of the administration's completely disastrous handling of it, because you feel invested, and because you are so indecisive in the beginning about whether you think this is a good idea or not. And you know, the disappointment throughout the book for you is so palpable, and that's also a nice contrast to Christopher Hitchens, who was much more polemical about the involvement in Iraq, and you know, kind of seemed to box himself into a corner that he then couldn't get out of.
Yeah, he forced himself into a position that was really untenable, but that because he's Hitchens, he kept fortifying rather than abandoning the position.
Yeah.
By the way, I miss him more and more. I miss his presence. I miss the incredible energy and life he brought to the the literary world. There's no one like him. So
yeah, I agree.
These are little criticisms that don't change my basic affection and admiration. So when I went to Iraq, it was the summer of 2003, and I'd come under the influence of the Iraqi exiled intellectual Kenan Makia, who is a brilliant writer and an extremely moral person, and who, being an Iraqi, desperately wanted the war because he wanted the overthrow of one of the worst dictators in the history of the 20th century, Saddam Hussein. And so I spent a lot of time listening to Kenan, following him around, kind of seeing the buildup to the war through his eyes. And then I went to Iraq, and within about 2 days, every one of my preconceptions had been shattered, just completely exploded, as if they had run over an IED. And there was one moment I remember in particular, and this brings back Orwell. I was driving in this hot little car of a Iraqi Christian psychiatrist. The car was like a tin box in a 110-degree day with of course, no air conditioning. And it was just, everything was difficult and uncomfortable. But this doctor, Dr. Bahir Bhutti, we were talking, and I was assuming that he agreed that the overthrow of Saddam was a good thing, and that the Ba'ath Party was essentially a kind of pale version of the Nazi Party, and et cetera, et cetera. And instead, he said to me, he did some good things, the Baathists. And it just went wrong. It was like the revolution that went wrong. And then he said, just like Animal Farm. And that kind of made me sit up and think, wow, I'm in an interesting place. And I said, well, how can you say they did good things? They killed hundreds of thousands of people. What about the 9 Jewish Iraqis who were hanged in Tahrir Square in 1968 with hundreds of thousands of people screaming for their blood? I mean, talk about Orwell. That was 1984. And he looked at me and said, they were spies. They had to be killed. Any country would have done that. They were spies. And I stopped and was about to argue vehemently. This is a key scene in Kenan Makia's major book, Republic of Fear, the execution of these totally innocent Iraqi Jews who were just scapegoats for Saddam. But I didn't argue with him. I thought, just keep your eyes and ears open. This is going to be interesting. Whatever you think of this place was wrong. It is now time to start learning. And that actually excited me. It meant I could do what journalists love to do, which is to be given access to parts of the world you're not supposed to go to, and see how people live and how they think. And that is kind of what the whole book is. It's a process of unlearning and learning big ideas and concrete realities in Iraq. And so that's one of the things that journalism has given me, is the chance to essentially blow up my own precious ideas.
I want to come back to that because it's I think something that runs through all your books. But perhaps we can take a few questions here. I see some raised hands. Anna, do you want to go first?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was just seeing Sean Hughes laugh, a big laugh, when you were talking, George, about driving around Iraq. And I'm sure that at some point, Sean, you will get the mic and tell us more about Iraq. Yeah, I love the point of missing Hitchens. I definitely thought about him more in the past 5 years than when he was alive. And how much I would just love to hear what he thinks about this whole madness. I'm sure we will come back to the point of, living in an era where it doesn't pay to be disagreeing with yourself, or even just to ask certain questions, right? Sometimes asking the question is in itself a crime, which is probably something that scientists take very hardly. But what I wanted to go back to Orwell. There's this kind of pop sci wisdom of teenagers discovering randomly some music when they're 17, and it's forever determining their taste in music and their outlook on the human morality. But I don't think that's true, right? You didn't stumble upon Orwell by accident. You went and picked it out in a very important moment in your life. And basically general education's responsibility here was to let you know that Orwell exists, even if at first you didn't like him, so that when you needed him, you would know where to go. But I don't know many, maybe Morten, but I don't know many 17-year-olds who are a little bit depressed and go and pick out Orwell to get better. And I'm wondering how you're feeling about that, and what was it that you were looking for? Was it the complexity already? Was it that things are more difficult or more complicated than they look? And how was that comforting?
Well, I was 23, so I was a little maybe worthier of your credulity here. Yeah, I was 23. I graduated from college. I'd spent almost 2 years in a little village in Togo in West Africa. So I was a grown-up. But honestly, I picked up that book pretty randomly. I wasn't looking for Orwell. I was looking for something to distract me on the long plane ride home that I was dreading. I was dreading going home and dreading having to explain the last year and a half to my mother and my sister. And there was a lot to try to hide from in a book. And that book, maybe I started reading the book in the bookstore, and the first sentence or sentences, which in the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, the day before I joined the militia, I met an Italian militiaman. And that's slightly wrong, and then the rest of the paragraph describes the face of this militiaman. What did he look like? What kind of face was it? And Orwell says it was the face of a man who would kill for a friend, and who didn't understand maps, couldn't read or write, but it was a fierce, pathetic face. And for him, it was the face of the Spanish Revolution. It was the face of the working class that had brought the revolution and that was fighting it, and that was about to get fought by the other side, by not just the fascists, but the communists. So this face, this description of the face, I don't know, there was something so attentive about it. Like when you're depressed, you can't pay attention. You are in a fog, and the fog itself is frightening because you know the world is going on around you, and you can't grab it, and you can't make meaning out of it. And the lack of meaning itself was depressing me. Then I had become kind of lost in a sort of nihilism, like all the things that had been the pillars of my life when I was a young American in high school and college were gone when I went off to Africa, and I didn't know how to replace them. And so somehow those sentences and that attentiveness and that clarity of observation and this straightforward voice, that simple, straightforward, I'm not going to disguise things, I'm going to talk about myself, but it's only to describe a face of someone else. All of that just, I don't know, it cut through the fog. It gave me the feeling of, if I could write like this about Africa, about what I had just been living in, then I could maybe get out of the fog, and it would be writing that would save me. I know this is all very melodramatic, but that was the feeling those sentences gave me, maybe in the bookstore. And maybe that was why I bought the book and took it onto the plane and had that book to read. And by the time I landed, I knew that I wanted to write a book about my time in Africa, and that it would probably be modeled on the book I just read. So it was important.
Morten, do you mind if I just come back to this? Because it seems like I completely get it, and I don't think it's melodramatic in any way. And this is basically, to me, sounds like being disappointed in cheap idealism and then finding that actually idealism is filled with real human faces. And the only way to talk about idealism is to talk about the faces that inhabit it.
Exactly. I mean, Orwell went to Spain in order to write, but immediately decided that this is not something I can stay out of. I have to join the side of the Spanish Republic. And he fought for about 5 months in Catalonia with this workers' militia, not with the International Brigade, which was over in Madrid, but so he wasn't with the famous celebrities. Hemingway was not, drinking cognac at the Florida hotel. And I've always hated Hemingway for the way he went to Spain and turned it into one more setting for his celebrity to hold forth. So Orwell was on his own with a bunch of Spanish workers, and so he had the true experience. And he was there as a witness when the communists in Barcelona began to round up the Trotskyists and accuse them of being fascist spies, which was a crucial turning point in the war. So he was disillusioned. He learned what fascism was, but also what communism was. Basically, it was the beginning of his career as a political writer. And he once, in that essay, Why I Write, that Morten mentioned, he wrote, after 1936, which was the year he went to Spain, every word I've written has been for democratic socialism and against totalitarianism. But I've tried to turn political writing into an art. That's the key. He knew where he stood politically, but he wanted it to be a kind of art form, not just to take a political side. And he lost a lot of his illusions, but not his idealism. You're right, Anna. His idealism kind of got hardened in the fire, but he said at the end of Homage to Catalonia, I believe in socialism more than ever, because I've been in these trenches with these Spanish workers and I love them. So how can I not want them to have the chance at a decent life? So I guess that's one way that experience can create a kind of writing, but it also can itself be deepened by the writing of it into something better, maybe more lasting than just youthful idealism.
Thank you so much. And I stop here, but I hope that we will get to the part in this conversation where we talk about the part in Our Man, where you say that politics is just bare character, and that there is something where you just kind of cut back to the bone and that's all you're left with, as opposed to the ideas.
A question from Roy.
Hi. I'm Roy, and I have so many questions, but I'll start with one, which is, and you guys can tell me if these are more appropriate for another portion of the conversation or something like that. I thought The Unwinding was the most cogent sort of set of tales to understand what was happening in America at that moment, and maybe in this moment, and I really appreciated it. And I had this feeling I often have when you read a book, and for those who haven't read The Unwinding, there's this sort of series of vignettes that follow, some of them repeated and some of them one-timers, follow different American stories to tell different stories about aspects of what's happening in the country. And one of the stories was about a staffer to Joe Biden, who, my recollection of it is that Biden basically shivs the guy. And my feeling about it was like, what a fucking jerk, And I'm curious, readers walk away with these oversimplified notions because there was much more nuance to the story than that, but also to understand for you as a writer who gets a view on some public figure, like, you write about Peter Thiel in that book, or Biden, let's take Biden. As his power has risen since then, how does that evolve your view on him? Or, sort of what's the relationship between changing facts and these perceptions that you build through a moment in time storytelling?
It's a great question, Roy. I never really had anything against Biden. He wasn't a hero of mine, but I didn't think of him as a monster. that story is not my point of view so much as it is Jeff Connaughton's point of view, the point of view of the staffer who did revere and idolize Biden and followed him through every stage of Biden's career, from the Senate to running for the White House in 1987, and then began to realize gradually that Biden wasn't going to do a goddamn thing for him in return. Even the simplest phone call to a potential employer who would have been a great help to Jeff Connaughton. So there was a sort of a kind of bullying quality to Biden and a transactional quality to the relationship that seemed true of politics and of Washington. Not true simply of Biden, but of this is what going into politics does. You go into it because you think this is the next Robert F. Kennedy, and eventually you realize that you're both in it for something more selfish, and you will continue to pretend that you're a Biden guy, as Connaughton said, because that is your carrying card in Washington. And Biden will continue to pretend that you're his buddy whenever he runs into you, but basically you don't like each other. So I thought this is more about Washington and about power and how all the Rosencrantzes and Guildensterns in Washington, who we never hear about, those obscure courtiers who make things happen, who really do write the legislation and tell the senator what's in the bill. Their experience is pretty interesting, and I wanted to.
A friend of mine called that the second comma in command. And having worked in government, I'll just say I share the same. So now I understand what you're saying. It was less about a tale about Biden and more Biden as a stand-in for what elected officials, maybe of a certain type, are like.
Yeah, they're not all the same, obviously, and some are going to treat their least important staffer with a lot of respect and decency. Biden was always on his way somewhere else. He was always on his way up. There's also a bit of Biden in Our Man, the book about Richard Holbrooke, and he doesn't come off so well there either. But there again, this is Richard Holbrooke's version of Biden. It's from Holbrooke's diary. My version of Biden is, this is a career politician who always stuck to wherever the center of the Democratic Party was, who didn't have any strong, passionate vision, but who was a good politician and a decent one. And suddenly history has chosen him to be a potentially transformative president. And that's just a joke history's played on us, that it's Joe Biden of all people who may be the one to finally put an end to the Reagan era and to begin something that we may even call the Biden era. So yeah, that's Biden's.
Yeah, I mean, if I could just offer, and immigrant family, so we express love through interruption. So Morten, if you want to interrupt me, feel free anytime, or George or anybody. But
we're talking about Biden not being able to listen, right? That's what George you write in Our Man, that Biden cannot listen. So let's interrupt each other.
Well, the irony, of course, is that coming from Holbrooke, who was not exactly known as the world's great listener. But several of the folks in the NSA staff have told me, that just have some friends who've said that they thought Our Man was the best book about how foreign policy in Washington actually works that they'd read, and were grateful. And I think it's mostly because they all, to be honest, despised Holbrooke, and it kind of justified some of their perception. So you were playing to their priors. But the thing that I think is interesting, I mean, maybe Biden, by the way, is the one playing the joke on us, because it turns out he was actually waiting to be this transformative man and show the courage of his convictions and all this stuff, which that's the idea, right? Play the game until you're in a position of power and then do the thing you meant to do. Who knows? But I thought the interesting parallel, just to offer a thought, was your book came up in many conversations, The Unwinding, as Hillbilly Elegy was becoming more popular. And that, obviously was a book that got lots of conversation and put JD up as this guy who was a person of his, who crossed worlds and a person of real integrity. And then, of course, we see as soon as he runs for office, what does he start doing? He starts successfully, I'll say, counterpoint to your argument about you can't debase your past self, saying, what was I saying when I said Trump was crazy? Actually, Trump's not crazy. I was crazy back then. And so it's just interesting how under some circumstances, when you play to a tribe, you do get permission to recant in some ways. I don't know, because I generally agree with your statement, and I just think it's an interesting counterfact.
No, as long as you come crawling back and apologize, although even apologies now are really like exposing your throat and saying, you know, please don't take the knife to it. And a lot of the time they'll take the knife to it anyway. But yes, if you are willing to submerge your values and your personality into groupthink, a lot can be forgiven. It's interesting that my book and his were compared because, I mean, they really are nothing alike. His is a memoir, mine is a piece of journalism. His is very much a passionate argument with his Appalachian family and roots, and mine is more of a broad picture of America with one or two parts of it, more or less in that part of the country. But it shows you, I guess, the fact that we were lumped together shows you how little has been written about.
Yeah, I mean, it was that and Strangers in Our Land as kind of three books that got talked about as if you're a coastal elite. And, right. You know, I say this as a person who's lived, you know, who now lives between the coast of Lake Michigan and Milwaukee and San Francisco. If you're a coastal elite, these were the books that you could read to understand what was Applebee's America, maybe was the other one in that category. Right. You know, much thinner book, obviously.
And that's sort of sad. You don't want to be
I agree.
the Bedecker, the Fodor for elite Americans to get to have a thrill in.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, but it is true that Trump made that tribe really important. Until Trump, they had been submerged, and a lot was going on, as I found out when I traveled to Western North Carolina, but they were submerged. They didn't feel heard, and Trump heard them, and the result was a lot of trouble. And suddenly the New York Times had to send correspondents out to the middle of the country, like opening foreign bureaus, in order to understand why it had gotten the election wrong. But that's another story.
We'll probably get to. We have another question here from Sean.
Thank you. May I ask about your research process? I understand that personal experience is a big component of your writing, but to what extent does reading feed into and build your writing?
A great deal. I mean, to be honest, journalists rarely have time to read as much as they would like to read or claim to have read. So there's always a race, like you get assigned a story. You don't have 3 months to dive into the library and read everything there is to know about Sierra Leone or counterinsurgency. But so I'm sort of reading the entire time. I usually travel when I go abroad with a bag full of books. And again, I don't get to all of them. It's more aspirational, but history, historians, sociologists, they do so much work somewhat obscurely that journalists then squeeze dry. We benefit greatly from the hard and rather obscure toil of specialists. And if journalists who don't avail themselves are foolish, because someone else has done all this hard work, and you can learn so much so quickly from it, and it can really deepen your own understanding. So, for example, I went to Paris just after the Charlie Hebdo killings in 2015. And again, I didn't know what to read, but I was collecting books as I went along, and someone would recommend a book, I would get it. And eventually I found my way to a book by an Iranian French scholar on French prisons and on what the jihadis were doing in French prisons to recruit, and how the prisons had really become the prime recruiting ground for jihadism in France. And it was fascinating because he had sort of them divided up almost like in a college, like this is the bad boy fraternity, and this is the pious fraternity, and this is the muscle fraternity, you know, and the imams or whoever the leaders of the jihadis in the prison would sort of sort through them and figure out who were the likeliest targets. And the likeliest targets were often the ones who were alone. They would spot the lonely ones. I wouldn't have known any of this. I wasn't allowed to set foot in a French prison. And then I finally interviewed the scholar after reading his book, and that gave me the quotes I needed for the piece. But by that time, I knew what I was what I wanted from him and what his ideas were. And it gave me just a whole new view of how jihadism worked in France. And I would never have had it without reading his book. So I can't recommend highly enough for journalists to turn themselves into amateur scholars. You will never get there. We always know a lot about a very little, but we can at least, emulate scholars and make use of their work.
I think that's one of the major differences between, say, Orwell and his time and ours. I mean, you write again in your introduction to that selection of essays that a career like Orwell's would be difficult to undertake today. There is too much specialization writing, too little genuine independence, and not much room in the major newspapers and magazines for strongly individual essays.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I went to the New Yorker in 2003, and this was basically the beginning of my career as a magazine journalist, a magazine writer. And what the New Yorker really wanted and wants was reported narrative. So this is where, having spent all those years trying to write fiction and reading fiction, became immensely useful in just giving me the instinct for how to shape a scene, how to describe a character, a face, of what dialogue to listen for, and how to use it in a story, all of that. But the New Yorker really didn't want political essays. And so in a way, the little Orwell in me, who wanted always to be going from the particular to the general to the idea, had to sort of be squished a bit. And in fact, I remember once a New Yorker editor said to me, when I was kind of arguing for having a paragraph of ideas in a piece, and he didn't want it there, he said, the novel is superior to the essay. It was a really interesting, flat statement saying, you're ruining your narrative by having these ideas, basically. We want something more like a transparent narrative, which is sort of the ideal New Yorker reported piece. But I was a little like in a straitjacket with that, because I felt, but I have things to say, and I want to criticize, I want to propose things. And that was one of the reasons I went to the Atlantic in 2018, after 15 wonderful years of really learning how to write magazine journalism at the New Yorker. The Atlantic has more room for political essays. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I've written a bunch of them. And that's been both a kind of freeing up, but also like a return to the idea of writing that I had back in my 20s when I was reading Orwell's essays.
I was thinking that we mentioned this briefly before, that when you talk about the process of unlearning and learning that you went through in Iraq, that's kind of one of the common threads in a lot of your most recent books. And then I started to think about the trajectory of your career so far. And there seems to me that the unwinding is something that you could call your entire journalistic and essayistic career, that you've been a witness to, an observer of huge unwinding, both at home and abroad for America. And you see that, of course, in the unwinding itself, but also in Our Man, which is in a way a book about the unwinding of Pax Americana and the entire post-war, America as the global policeman. And both those types of unwinding are united somewhat in your most recent book. When you talk about the pandemic and what happened last year and is still going on, and the decline of the idea of America as a universal nation.
Yeah, I don't sit down to write books as part of a larger project. Each book has its own reasons and its own difficulties, and they kind of present themselves in in sort of indirect, even random ways. I mean, the Assassin's Gate came because I was interested in Iraq before the war because of Kanan Makia, who I knew. And my writing about him led the New Yorker to hire me. And then as my first assignment as a staff writer, to send me to Iraq. And then I kept going back over and over for 5 years. And that produced the Assassin's Gate. So there was something kind of contingent about that. There was no big plan. The Unwinding, once I came back from Iraq, started having a family, didn't really want to keep going to places where I was possibly going to get my head cut off. So I turned to American politics and did some reporting on the 2008 campaign and got very interested, not in Obama himself so much as in the dilemma of voters, especially like in Appalachian, Ohio, about whether or not to vote for this guy. And I began to sense a huge amount of distrust of all politicians and of all elites and institutions. And so while many other journalists were writing about Obama as a great success in the first year or two, I was drawn to go around to out of the way places where the recession was hitting hard and where Obama felt like a very distant figure and Washington felt distant. And fortunately, the New Yorker allowed me to do some of that reporting on the housing crisis in Tampa, Florida, on the green energy effort among some farmers in southwestern Virginia. And those became the basis for the Unwinding. I just found talking to ordinary people to be more revelatory than anything I could learn from insiders in the Obama administration. I felt like I was really beginning to see a country I didn't know. Partly because I'd been away a lot, but partly because the country had changed so much. What was new about it? I mean, just the sense of there's no more middle class, the system is rigged against us, everything is falling apart. Our pharmacy, our restaurant, and our shoe store have all closed. Go down to Main Street, look at what it's like. The media was so hated, except when it was a tribe that you could identify with, like Fox News. And I began to even to sense the beginnings of like disinformation and how people were getting their news from email chains and how they were learning that Obama was an Arab on email. And all of that seemed like something very almost, I don't want to say revolutionary, but like the country was in turmoil, even though from Silicon Valley or Washington or New York, it didn't really look that way. And I felt like this is the story. It's the story of our institutions falling apart and of the people breaking up into little pieces and not knowing what's real. And so it was simply a matter of going to these places and talking to people that I began to get the vision that was the Unwinding. And since then it's been called prescient and it predicted Trump and all that. It was only prescient because I went there and talked to people. Anyone could have found the same things if they had gone there and talked to people. But this is a weakness of the media. We don't. We talk to each other. We talk on social media, so opinion, we have lots of opinions. We don't report as much anymore. This was a story just waiting to be told. And it was my luck that there was practically no one else who was telling it. So that was the randomness of the Unwinding. I just happened to start going around and got interested. And that's kind of how all my books go. That I just get curious, I get interested. And it's always because there's some human being whose story moves me and who I want to get to know better. So there has been no grand master plan to chart the rise and fall of the American empire, although it sometimes seems like that's what I've done.
There's a question here that is related to what you just said about last best hope, and your idea of the four Americas, these four main narratives. And one of them is, of course, the one that you've just described, that you kind of stumbled on in the Unwinding. But there's a question here that someone asks, when reading Four Americas, I was struck by the clarity, cohesiveness, and empathy of your narrative. If we have time, I'd love to hear more about your process for crafting a narrative. So how do you work through the edges, conflicts, and loose threads, especially challenging or complex things that you had to answer or address?
The question is referring to the Four Americas essay in particular?
Yeah, and I think probably in general, how you craft a narrative. But I mean, that one is an especially interesting one.
I guess for me, there should never be an answer at the beginning. That's the first point I'd make. There should only be a question, and maybe even a provisional hunch about the question, because it's always helpful to track your own thinking and to see how it changes over the course of your reporting and writing, because it has to change it. I mean, life should change you, and that change is a key to understanding how what the real story is. So there should not be an answer. There should be a question or questions. And then my first impulse is always to go to the particular. If you look at the beginning of The Assassin's Gate, if you look at the beginning of The Unwinding, or even Our Man, the first 2 pages of Our Man are a description of Richard Holbrooke's feet and eyes. I think the feet part disturbed his widow and his friends a little bit, because his feet troubled him. They were a problem for him. But everyone I interviewed mentioned his goddamn feet, how he put them up on the table during meetings, how he would take his socks off, how he would borrow socks, how his feet swelled up. He obviously had a circulation problem that constantly troubled him, and it began to feel like this is a symbol of his feet of clay. I mean, this is what made Holbrooke a flawed and all too human, figure. So why not start with his feet? Because if I start with a bunch of generalizations about American foreign policy and the career of this diplomat and how it rose and fell with the course of the American century and blah, 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 not only would my reader get bored, but I would get bored. And I'm always writing with the fear of losing the reader. I mean, I'm afraid of losing our audience right now. It's just something like an anxiety that's constantly churning in me. Like they're about to tune out. They're about to put the book down. They're about to turn it off. And so I think it's actually not a bad state to be in as a writer, because the reader's attention is such a precious commodity, and you cannot squander it. You can't take it for granted. And if you lose it, you will not get it back. So for me, the way not to lose the reader from the start is to begin with particulars, with description, with feet. In the case of The Assassin's Gate, with a kind of mentally disturbed young woman who came up to me one day in Baghdad and started telling me lots of really wild things that all proved true eventually. A vignette. And then to let the vignette or the description open up the question or questions. What is this about? What are we trying to understand here? What is the meaning of this war? What is the meaning of this man? And I think then you've kind of got something solid and a kind of tension on the line. You're reeling in, you're reeling in the fish. The reader is the fish, and you're reeling the reader in, and it's a very long process, and you really can't let that line go slack. So I think narrative is just a constant question of how do I hold the reader's interest? What do I need to do next? What information should come next? What scene? How long should I go on with this scene before I end it? How do I end the chapter? Well, it has to end by pointing to the next thing. You want to feel that the story is going to continue, not that something has come to an end. So in all these ways, narrative is simply keeping tension on the line and avoiding that terrible feeling of, I was just fly fishing, and the terrible feeling of the line going slack. You had it and you lost it. You don't want to lose the reader. You may not get a reader back.
Amma, you have a question?
I have a question, but it's a little bit referring to something said earlier, so feel free to drop it and I can come back to it later. George, the first time we spoke, you told me that I had just finished Our Man, which I read kind of in a couple of sittings, and then I took a 1 month break before I read the last 20 pages because I didn't want him to die. I was like, I don't want this guy to die. I know what's coming. He's in poor shape, and you told me that you had no idea that this would kind of, grow into this gargantuan book, which really interests me because, if you're a proper fatalist, you would say, oh, there is this book and it takes over, right? It defines its own length and format and size. But I'm sure, that would be an extreme way of putting it. So I'm just wondering how flexible are you? Like if a book comes to you and it wants to be a 15 volume, series, do you just put everything aside and spend 30 years writing it?
Well, I used to feel that, a real book couldn't be less than 350 pages. If it's less than that, it's basically a magazine article, a glorified magazine article, or a padded, op-ed or something. You have to bleed and suffer and trudge and get exhausted.
Bestseller in Paris, right, and starve and all those things. Yeah,
exactly. It's got to be a bit of a mountain climb. But I've, in my later years, I have begun to think that less is more, and that I don't know how many more books I have in me, but I would like them not to be 600-page books. That takes an enormous amount of energy. The Holbrooke book came to me by accident in a way, like these others. I was working on the Unwinding. It was not going well. I was having a very hard time figuring out how all the reporting fit together into one narrative. And we could talk about how I solved that problem, but it was a big problem. And suddenly Richard Holbrooke, who I knew a little and had profiled for the New Yorker, died. And a friend of his suggested I write a biography of him. I had never thought of myself as a biographer. This is a category like journalism that for me was kind of like a lesser category. Like, why would I simply sink myself into every letter so-and-so ever wrote and have to dig up every last girlfriend, et cetera, et cetera. But I thought Holbrooke is pretty interesting. So I went to see his widow and asked her if she would let me have these papers I knew existed, these personal papers. And she agreed to, with no strings attached. So I'd kind of taken on a project without even knowing why. That was early 2011. It took 2 more years to finish the Unwinding, and then a year of sort of the aftermath of the book coming out. And so by 2014, I had really not begun the Holbrooke book. Kati Martin, his widow, was, I think, getting rightly a little impatient with me. And so I began reading his letters. I'd almost begun to think I'd made a mistake and I should abandon this, because just why do I want to write the whole life of somebody? I had no reason for it. I didn't know why I was doing it. But reading his letters from Vietnam in his early 20s was such a wonderful thing, because he's such a good writer and they told such amazing, graphic, vivid stories. I thought, okay, I could do this, but I'm going to do it like a novel. This is going back to what we were talking about earlier. I'm going to have to make this something different from a conventional biography. First, because no one wants to read a biography of Richard Holbrooke. I mean, yes, he's interesting, but he's not Henry Kissinger. He's not Charles de Gaulle. He's not a historic figure. And second, I would be bored by having to write a biography, having to write a cradle to grave, dutiful monument to the figure, like that kind of book. It just didn't interest me. And one day I was driving and I suddenly heard this voice, which is very unusual in my life. I don't hear voices, but this voice said, Holbrooke, yes, I knew him. I had no idea where that voice came from or who it was. All I knew was I liked it. It excited me. I wanted to follow it, to listen to it. It became the voice of the narrator of the book. And those are the first words of the book. And I suddenly had this feeling of, I can invent something. I can invent a narrator, and I can tell the story as if this is a novel by the narrator about someone he knew, instead of about this figure and who I would have to go interview people. I did all the research, but then I just buried the research in the narrative. So there's no trace of my interviews. There's no trace of all the reading I did. It's in the notes, but the narrative is like a novel, so that you feel you're being told the story of someone that the narrator knows. And that made it worth doing. It made it exciting and fun.
Feel free to raise your hands, everyone, if you have more questions, or type them in the chat. George, I'm curious, since you've since the Last Best Hope deals so much with what happened last year with the pandemic, the election, protests, and so on. I and others I've spoken to have felt, as writers, very unproductive during the pandemic, despite having, ostensibly more time to ourselves and more time to sit and write, but finding it just very hard to do, and generally being just extraordinarily distracted by, first by trying to get used to, or trying to orient oneself in the world and what was going on and how long this was going to last for. Then, of course, the protests over the summer, then the election. And I wonder how you felt. Presumably also, stuck remotely somewhere. Obviously, you have a family, so that changes things. But as a writer, what you felt some of the challenges were, and how this book, in a sense, came to be.
I felt very much the way you did and others did. The first few months of the pandemic, I could hardly write anything. The isolation was depressing. The uncertainty and fear were, provoked anxiety, depression. I couldn't go out and interview people, which is always, for me, a reviving, rejuvenating thing. It's always bringing, new things to me when I can do that. So I was in the same state of being reclusive, and I did have to keep my kids, trying to keep them focused on school when that was almost impossible, and then try to give them a semblance of some kind of summer experience when camps were shut. I guess I felt by the end of the summer that we were on the precipice of destruction. I felt this horrible sense of dread that if Trump got reelected, it would be the end of America and the democracy, at least, that we have known, for better and worse. Because not just because of what Trump would be able to do with the power of reelection, but because we had wanted him to do it, because the majority of Americans had said, take another 4 years. That to me would mean we're finished. And I guess that galvanized me. Like, I wanted to try to put a claim in for it's worth trying to save this thing. as much as I've been staring for years now at what is wrong in our wars, in our economy, in our society, all of its injustice, I suddenly felt almost like a passion for the country. You know, like something I really cared about was committing suicide, or might commit suicide. And you know, that feeling is enough to pin a short book on. Like, it's enough to get you out of the hole you're in. Just what you need to write is energy. And that kind of feeling gave me enough energy to think, okay, I've got some time here. I can't travel. I could write a kind of essay. This book is not a long narrative with a lot of characters. It's basically an essay in which I look at why we're about to commit suicide and why we're worth saving. I began it about 3 weeks before the election. I just remember utter dread. People were arming up. Stores were boarding up. There was a sense that we might be moving into real political violence here, no matter what the outcome. Plus, if you remember, that was a season of huge wildfires in the West and of big storms on the Gulf Coast, of basically global warming bearing right down on us just as the pandemic was making a comeback. Everything just seemed to be going wrong. And of course, there were the largest protests in our history, calling attention to the incredible injustice of George Floyd's killing and of killings like it. So early mid-October, I started writing, and I immediately knew that I had to find a voice that could, like that Holbrooke, yes, I knew him, could immediately connect to the reader. Not, you know, American democracy has been through many ups and downs. You know, that would have been the wrong way to go. No, something intimate, like this is about me and you. And so the first sentence is, I'm an American. No, I don't want pity. And that kind of got me into a voice in which I could sort of express lots of thoughts without having to worry about whether they sounded like official political thoughts. They were more like just what my reactions, my feelings of the moment. So I've started it, and then, you know, the election came. The election was one of the most smooth and unbelievably successful in our history. Then came Trump's lies, and then came January 6th, and then came Biden's inauguration and the vaccine. So that was like a 3-month period in which a lot happened. And I sort of withdrew from the news during that period to write the book. It's something I sometimes do to protect myself from too much information coming at me. So I just kind of took in the major things, but was basically writing the book during those 3 months. And once I get going, I write pretty quickly. So it was a pretty fast process. But just to finish, I was in a funk for months and months. And I'm now in another funk, postpartum funk, with the book out, because the well goes dry and it takes a while for the water to, you know, to rise again.
Anna, you have a question?
I have a comment, but maybe Matt is in front of me, or you lowered your hand.
It's cool. Yeah, whatever. You can go first, actually. It's fine.
Thank you. I just wanted to share that, you know, Interintellect itself started in a moment of panic. The first iteration of this organization came to exist in October 2016 between Brexit and Trump. Up to that point, you know, I was always looking at my shortcomings and what are all the things I can't do. And then there's a moment when you're like, none of that matters. Nobody cares. What can you do? And suddenly nothing mattered. My time or my energy or whatever degree I have, it became very goal oriented. And, you know, it took another maybe 4 years for it to take its shape. But I totally get that. And I think there are many people here in the room who who can identify whether as writers or not with that insanely strong call to arms. And you're like, there's no excuse. Like, what is your excuse for staying in bed when something is on fire, sometimes literally? And, you know, when people talk about these crazy energies being unleashed, that's what we are talking about. And it's the same thing as Orwell saying that this guy would die for his friend. He wouldn't die for some whatever distant politician. And one of the things I wanted to add, when I was a kid, I always asked, like, why is it that they're you know, I come from the middle of like Eastern Europe, right? Like there's something is always on fire and people are like, well, we pack up again, you know, what's new? And I was always like, you know, my father had this big theory about, you know, and I was like 5, so I thought that my father's theories are very valid and lasting, that, you know, America is a very stable and peaceful place because it's prosperous. And like Lao Tse, you know, if people are prosperous, that people are peaceful. And he said that there's no revolution in America because it's big. If you don't like it somewhere, you can just bugger off and move to, you know, a long flight away into a different time zone, different climate, different geography, different everything, different culture. And I remember watching the Capitol riots this January, and I was feeling that, wow, America has become small. You no longer can move away from New York City into Montana and not have to worry about it. And this shrinking, you know, to me, it takes me back to this childhood concept. And if that's true, that's really huge. That means that something in the fundamental texture of that culture has changed. And I kept thinking about it as I was reading Last Best Hope, that this is the shrinking. That maybe, you know, 50 years ago, you would not have been able to summarize all Americans in 4 categories, in 2 axes.
That's frightening. I think what you're saying is we're becoming a normal country. You're
becoming too European. That there's a lot of blood there. Religious wars. You have to.
We're getting there. We're getting there. I mean, don't you think, Anna, that Trump is the first European president we've ever had? I mean,
Eastern European president. That's worse.
Yes,
like Emmanuel Macron, fine, you know.
Like, he's a Slavic president. I mean, you expect him to speak Serbian. So
I come from a country that has 7 neighboring countries, and we hate all of them, and we don't speak any of their language.
I think the shrinking, the shrinking you're talking about, the shrinking you're talking about may be that we're no longer able just to distract ourselves with the next new thing. Whether it's literally moving across the country or, you know, Americans are always reinventing themselves, starting a new job, you know, getting divorced and remarried, taking a new name, you know, getting a new gadget, a new device. We have 1,000 ways to distract ourselves with novelties, and we've always been able to do it because of the solidity of our basic system. We have an incredibly stable constitutional system. And in the last 5 or 10 years, it has begun to crack. And the cracking makes everyone have to think about politics more. And even all the time. It's one of the things that strikes me about the last few years is how much more people think about politics, talk about it, how much it infects their relationships and their colors their view of the person at the store or the driver who just drove you off the road. That wasn't always true. We had the luxury of being living private lives, and now we're like so many other countries. We're a hyper politicized people, which means we're hyper polarized, and we hate each other. So. And the stability of our system is no longer something we can count on. So there's an existential dread underneath every day. And those things make us more like the rest of the world, I think. Right before the election, I had a conversation with an Iranian ophthalmologist who said to me, you Americans don't understand how quickly this can all fall apart and how far it can go and how long it can take for you to come back. And in fact, you'll never come back completely. Trust me, I'm an Iranian, I know. And so in a way, we were now having to listen to those broken countries that we used to go out and try to patch up, because now we are becoming a place that's, you know, possibly going to be that way. And so we need to take lessons from people who have lived in those countries about what mistakes not to make.
And I both agree and don't agree to kind of go to the auto-contrarianism of Christopher Hitchens. Because yeah, on the one hand, you have the entropy and the idea that there are, you know, levels of unlikely complexity that are likely to go away. So for instance, if humans died out, it would be very unlikely for Homo sapiens to again develop, right? It's not something that would just like, you know, continue happening. But it's also possible that because a lot of these changes have been brought about by the internet, we are actually not entering the past of Europe, but the future of the world in a way that we haven't seen before. Because what we're talking about is that, you know, the traditional axes of space and time, right, which defined a lot of things in the stability of America, which was that you have space, you can go away, and you have time, which is this quickly kind of fluctuating trends and fads and presidents, is no longer valid. Because you have the internet, which shrinks the space of, you know, the established opinion, but it also deprives us as a society from the normal metabolism of trends. You have pocket universes on the internet where the same untruths are regurgitated until forever, because there's no gatekeeper there, there's no third party to double check. So you have these, you know, little boiling pockets of opinions that we don't know about. As you say, you know, like some of the lies of that Trump has so kindly shared with the world will live on, right? They will be like latent illnesses. And the moment the immune system, for whatever reason, is off, one of those can come. And that, to me, that changes what, for instance, journalism should be about. Because I want to know what are these hidden opinions. As you want to know about latent illnesses you might have, and you go to the doctor, even if you're feeling fine. That's how journalism should work in America today, no? The yearly checkup, you go to the dentist.
Preventive journalism. All true, Anna. I'm not smart enough to add anything to that.
I want preventive journalism. I would pay for that.
Okay.
We have a question from Sean Carter.
Okay, thank you for answering another question from me. So, as someone who has studied crises in many different places and times, and if you've already written about this, I apologize. As someone who has studied crises in many different places and times, how does this American crisis that we experience now in the early 2020s differ? Is there some way in which it is unique among those you've seen, and if so, how?
I mean, it's always tempting to reach for analogies. So last year, when I finally was able to get something written in the early going of the pandemic, I wrote an essay for The Atlantic about what it was like in the early going of the pandemic. And what it was like was the government doesn't care if we live or die. There's no one there. The parents have abandoned us to our fate. I mean, there was an incredible sense that I, at least as an American, had never had. I know some Americans live with this, but I had not had to live with it. The feeling of we're on our own and we have to fend for ourselves and figure this out ourselves because the government has no plan. There's a lot of nonsense coming from the White House. It's been kicked to the governors and the governors are trying to kick it back. And what do we do? That reminded me a little bit of reporting I've done in failed states, in Iraq and some West African countries and Afghanistan. So The Atlantic called my piece, "We Are Living in a Failed State." And that got a fair amount of criticism because, of course, we're not living in a failed state. There's a long way to go before we get to anything like that point. We still have institutions that work. We still have some degree of security. economic as well as, public safety. We're not in some neighborhood in Baghdad where the people have to arm themselves and set up a checkpoint and, pay the local teacher out of their own pocket. So there's no comparison in my experience, because the comparisons that I have in my head are all extreme cases like that. All I would say, though, is I was aware that it would be foolish to imagine that that had nothing to do with us, that we are essentially safe. It's good that it's going to be okay. Because again, as that Iranian doctor said, you Americans don't understand. You've never been through this. You haven't had the experience of things falling apart to that degree. I wanted to at least sort of shake my own potential complacency by saying, well, we have to think that it could happen. It hasn't happened. But January 6th was, and the whole post-election experience could have gone many different ways and easily could have led to a constitutional crisis and possibly violence in the streets. And it could happen again. I don't see how it in some ways cannot happen with the Republican Party changing the election rules, and with the will to power and a kind of nihilistic spirit on that side, with Trump as the ringmaster just taking over. I don't see how we can avoid going through it again. And this time around, will our institutions hold as they did in 2020? I'm not confident. So that's the kind of crisis, that we're in. I don't know. Is there, those of you who know Europe better than is there an analogy for what we're living through right now?
Yes, but because it's America, everything is bigger and louder and probably less well constructed. But this was something that was so striking to me about the four Americas. First of all, you feel seen. You read it and you know exactly what you were talking about. Any person that you would give it to in the world would know. It's like, kind of the Foreman effect in astrology. Like you just know that one of these is you. But none of these four is in any way a stabilizing one, right? They are
right.
all praying.
I think, yeah. I don't know if I need to describe them to our audience, but there are these four narratives that I pick out as the dominant ones of this period of unwinding, the last 40 years, let's say. Free America, that's Reagan. Smart America, that's Clinton and Obama. Real America, that's Trump. Just America, that's the protests last summer and kind of the new generation. This leaves out a lot of people. This is not a portrait of the country. It's not a demography. It's a more like literary analysis. Like, how do people interpret their country? What is the identity that they give it? And those are the four major ones. And they all are in some form of combat with the others and are exclusive of the others and demand losers. There are always losers in these narratives. And in Free America, the losers are the takers, as Mitt Romney called them. And the winners are the makers. In Smart America, the losers are the uneducated. In Real America, the losers are the elites and the immigrants. And in Just America, the losers are essentially the oppressor class, because they're going to be overthrown and the oppressed are going to take their place. So they're all in some ways zero-sum narratives, and in that way they are unstable. Yeah.
Jackie, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I think that was pretty funny actually, because I thought the Four Americas was an example of preventive journalism. So I think what was so funny for me reading it was kind of the slight sense of shame you feel when you read your own character.
But that's me
so-
too, Jackie. It's a self-portrait, not a pretty one.
Yeah, exactly. I think my question was really, and there's just one other point I was going to make, which is around Anna, your point around prosperity leading to stability is a pretty funny one for me. I'm a British immigrant to Australia, and as a country, it's so entertaining because the prosperity of the country means that there is like no political affiliation at all. I've never heard anyone talk about politics here. I would have no idea what party any single one of my colleagues votes for, and I find that astonishing, and I think it is purely due to prosperity. The fact that like nobody has to care because there's a high minimum wage, and there's also like most people are relatively wealthy, and so obviously there, as with any country, there are many groups who are less fortunate than others, but it's an interesting place to live for that reason.
Wow.
My question was really around apathy and advocacy. I think what's funny about my generation is I'm 32, so I feel like my generation is just a really apathetic generation. Like we kind of did nothing. And yet I feel like this kind of next generation of kids who are kind of in their early 20s are they have much more agency. But yet it feels like a lot of their advocacy feels short term, and you kind of create a large splash and then it all kind of disappears quite quickly. And I guess in your research and experience in this world for quite a long time, what type of advocacy do you find that is the most effective longer term?
I'll give you one example. I think you're right about the generations. I mean, I would maybe draw the line a little differently and say that people under 35 seem much more, you said you're 30, right?
32, yeah.
Yeah. In this country, people under 35 generally are a far more political cohort than people over 35 or 40, than my generation, because they've been politicized by the wars, 9/11, the financial crisis, the recession, Trump. It's just been one shock after another. And so the result is they are rather like the hated boomers, who were also this highly political generation that thought that the world began when they arrived on the scene. We're kind of going through that all over again. And so naturally, these two giant cohorts are in elephantine collision with each other, the boomers and the millennials, but they really resemble each other a lot. So as far as advocacy goes, I'm thinking of this one group I've gotten to know quite well. And it's called the International Refugee Assistance Project. I'm very interested in refugees. It's been a kind of concern of mine ever since the 90s and then Iraq. And this group began with a specific mission to try to help Iraqis who had worked with the United States to get out before they got killed. And so I was writing a lot about that. So I talked to this group, and the fact that they were so focused on this one thing, a very concrete thing with a list of names, and contacts in Congress and the State Department who were helpful. And it meant that they really could be effective. They were not simply recording abuses. They were not proposing, a utopia. They had a very specific goal, and it could actually, their success could be measured in human lives. And since then, they've expanded beyond Iraq to all refugees. But right now, as we speak, they are working very hard to get Afghans in the same situation out of Afghanistan, because the whole country is collapsing and the Taliban are closing in on the cities. And in those cities are many Afghans who work either with American troops or with American diplomats or with American journalists. And I know journalists who are getting phone calls from their Afghan interpreters saying, can you get me out? They're coming, they're going to kill me. So I don't know, a group like that, IRAP, they're called, They were founded by a woman named Becca Heller and, oddly enough, a man named John Feiner, who is now the Deputy National Security Advisor to Joe Biden. So John Feiner is inside, and people outside are hammering on him to evacuate the Afghans. So he's finding out what it's like to be on the other side of advocacy. Anyway, I like that group very much. And I think part of their attraction for me and their success is just how specific their focus is, and how, yeah, it's at the human level. They actually know the names of the people that they're trying to help.
Thank you.
I don't know if that helps answer that question, but that's kind of my best shot.
Sean, you have a question?
Thank you. Yes, this has been wonderful and surprisingly depressing.
No. Okay, let's spend the last 25 minutes on things we love and feel good about.
We'll just read Orwell. We'll read Orwell in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah,
I really don't want to depress you.
No, it's been wonderful. Thank you. And you bring up this great point about advocacy for refugees. And I know we haven't brought up what you brought, the play Betrayed, and what led you to advocate for refugees and interpreters. What led you to write the play Betrayed, what you learned from writing that as opposed to your novels and the other books. And if I may, and Anna, thank you for this. I work for a veteran organization here in Pittsburgh, PA. Would love to, George, invite you onto my podcast to discuss the interpreters in Afghanistan for our military audience.
I'd love to, and I'd be honored. So you can get my email from Anna, or I'll find a way to get it to you. But
Many thanks.
Absolutely. Well, the last story I did from Iraq was in early 2007. It was the absolute rock bottom of the war. I mean, hundreds of bodies were turning up on the streets of Baghdad every morning. It was the Sunni Shia civil war at its worst. And it was just before the surge, which actually for a while did turn the violence down a little bit. And I had read a couple stories about Iraqis working at the US Embassy who were asking their American bosses, if you leave, do you have an evacuation plan for us? And the bosses had nothing close to that. They weren't really even all that clued into the fact that their Iraqi employees were getting death threats and were even being killed. And I don't know, this is the kind of thing, back to why I write, it just angered me so much to think of Iraqis who I knew a lot of Iraqis like this, who had basically staked their lives on the vision that America came with. Democratic Iraq, join the modern world, young people will travel, you will have a say in your society, you'll be free to choose your own fate. And that was, it had become a nightmare because of our folly and our stupidity, and as well as theirs. And it just angered me so much that young people, especially, who had pinned so much hope on us, had been betrayed by us and were now being abandoned by us. We were not helping them get out. We were not paying attention to them. And that feeling of being angry about an injustice is a strong motive for writing something. And in some ways, that one I did have the answer at the beginning. I knew that this was an injustice. I knew that I didn't know the extent of it. I had to go back to Iraq and interview some officials and hear their utter cluelessness and their heartlessness about it, or their excuses, and then meet the Iraqis. And I met maybe 10 or 15 Iraqis. It was very difficult to meet people at that point. I had to find ways to get into, Kurdistan with them, or to go to a hotel where we would, kind of be disguised on our way through the lobby or whatever. It was very hard, but their stories, what I ended up doing was hearing their stories from start to finish, not just what's happening now. You're hiding, you're trying to escape, you need to get out of the country, you're getting death threats, but the entire story of the war. So I think I must have gotten, hundreds and hundreds of pages of stories from this particular group of Iraqis who spoke good English, so that made it a lot easier. And I went home and wrote a 16,000 word New Yorker piece called Betrayed that did have a slightly concussive effect. It's rare that anything I write or anything anyone writes really changes what people in power do. But this one did get the attention of people in Congress and some people in the Bush administration. But somehow I wasn't done with it because, I don't know, these voices that I've been hearing in Iraq were still ringing in my head. And I felt that I wanted to get out of their way. I didn't want to have to be the mediator between them and the reader. I wanted them to be able to speak directly. And I've always loved theater. I wanted to be an actor when I was like 12, and I loved going to the theater. And there's nothing more electric than good live theater. So I thought, why not write a story about them in which they're doing the talking? In other words, a play. I didn't know if I could, but there was a theater in Soho that wanted it, and that it, gave me encouragement. And the process of turning it into a play was essentially squeezing the journalism out of it. Each draft, each rehearsal, each new iteration with the director, it became less and less the journalism I'd done and more these characters who became their own people, less and less faithful to the Iraqis who I was basing them on. And that's what, in a way, I was writing fiction again for the first time in a long time. But this was a sort of happy experience of writing fiction in the form of drama. And it had a really good run in New York, 5 months. And we had all these events after the play was over on stage with Iraqis coming up and telling their stories directly, people I knew, people I'd helped get out of Iraq. I was just completely consumed with this drama of the Iraqis who were trying to get out. I had this poem in my head from James Fenton, the British poet, that he'd written after leaving Cambodia in 1975. It's essentially the story of the Killing Fields, the movie. And the poem goes, "One man shall smile one day and say goodbye. Two shall be left to die. One man shall give his best advice. 3 men shall pay the price. One man shall live to regret. 4 men shall pay the debt. One man shall wake from terror to his bed. 5 men shall be dead. 1 man to 5, 1,000,000 men to 1, and still they die, and still the war goes on." And my voice is actually a little shaky here because that poem is reminding me of those people and of the drama of their lives and how we failed them, how we totally failed them. So anyway, that's a state of mind that can certainly get me energized to write something.
Thank you.
Matt, I saw that your hand was raised just before.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt people. So I'm really interested in the way that you mix sort of literature and journalism. I liked what you were saying earlier about how you thought that all good writing was like novels that were, 500 pages long, and you're reading Conrad and so forth. And then with Orwell, so I mean, as a person, I generally tend to like to separate politics from art. And at the same time, though, I very much honor and admire George Orwell. And he said, I want to make political writing into an art. And everything that I have written is about supporting X thing and about fighting against Y thing, right? Democratic socialism, v fascism. And so I feel like with the division that you're talking about in America, and that I see all the time in all kinds of different ways, the tendency to, you can diagnose the problems in the country, and then at some point, and you do this in your new book, which I really appreciate, you actually do kind of belly up to the bar and say, here are some answers that I actually want to suggest about what's to be done about this. But at the same time, and this is not necessarily a critique of the book as it is, it's just when the writer becomes engaged and really starts to try to like get into the fray and hit the barricades, sometimes the writing really suffers, you know, and you lose kind of the novelistic sympathy, sensibility. And so I don't write fiction, but I do write a lot of criticism, and there's definitely times where you sort of start to bump your head up against like, am I going to start getting didactic now, right? And especially in times like these where, you know, things are flying off the handle. I kind of wanted to jump in after Anna was talking about that because it could fit a little bit better thematically. But so where do you thread that needle when you're writing? I mean, do you feel like you want to stay more with a novelistic perspective, but then the times call for, you know, policy? Yeah, I'm really curious where you go with that. Yeah.
Well, the last word you use, policy, is a frightening word to me. I don't think of myself as being at all expert in policy, and the belly up to the bar suggestions I made in the last part of Last Best Hope are so unoriginal, it's painful. I mean, they're just out there. I just wanted to synthesize them and say, let's think about how we could find a better narrative, call it Equal America. What would it mean? Anti-monopoly, pro-worker, blah, blah, blah. That's not my normal mode at all. And I kind of hope never to do it again. I think it probably hurt the book in a way, like it took some of the fizz out of the writing, having to go to policy. But as you say, I felt like I owed it to the reader to at least come up with some actual concrete solutions. I suppose that there's no really good answer to your really wonderful question. The best I can say is there is a tension between wanting to tell a good story, wanting to explore a human character to the very depths, wanting to write good sentences and tell things truly. And I'm not neutral. I mean, I'm not just floating through the world looking for beautiful sentences. I have convictions. I mean, the convictions are never entirely fixed. I mean, I have some core values: freedom, equality, tolerance, reason. I mean, the Enlightenment. Those are my core values. But that's very abstract. And when it comes to politics, I've changed a lot over the years and have changed my mind 100 times about some things. So I guess those two things are always in some tension. I think that's what you're getting at, right? And the further you go toward, here I stand, I can do no other, the less, in some ways, the less interesting your writing is going to be. It's going to lose some complexity. It's going to lose some texture. It's going to take you away from the world of things, the world of beautiful particulars. Instead, you're going to be floating in a bunch of abstractions. So, and yet, without the convictions, without those beliefs, there is no motive to write a good sentence. I guess if there's any answer to this, it's probably just to always hold yourself and your own side to the same standard as you hold the other side. And that will inevitably make the danger of simplification and didacticism a little less of a danger. More the argument with yourself and your own side, which I have all the time, enriches things. Don't shy away from it. It will enrich things. It will make it more interesting. It will even lead to better writing. You know when you're headed into sort of the stiff phrasing of propaganda or of, dogma. It kills the writing. So when you feel the writing dying because it's turning into dogma, it means you're not looking hard enough at yourself and your own side, your own position. And if you take that hard look, I think that kind of releases the language and makes it fresh again. And so in a way, the virtue of being unsure is rewarded by better writing. I think. I'm probably not always. I'm sure there are examples of people in a white heat writing with just blazing conviction and creating imperishable prose. There are examples. I know some of them, but that's not generally how I approach it.
And I don't know if you remember, George, when you and I first met, it was probably exactly 2 years ago. We had coffee at some coffee shop in Brooklyn, and we were, I think, partying outside and chatting about writing and the current climate. And you had said something to which I gave a rather sheepish response, which was something along the lines of, "Oh, I can, never make up. I don't know what I think about these things. I can never really make up my mind," and sort of expressing fear that kind of uncertainty wouldn't translate into good writing, or that it would be misinterpreted or something. And I remember you just said, you sort of politely nodded and said, "Well, then what's the point?" and I've been thinking about it ever since, because it was I think a jolt that I needed at that time to be so much less concerned with the perception of one's writing, or writing because you are anticipating a certain reaction, and reconciling oneself to a certain degree of uncertainty and lack of conviction, and for that to be part of the texture of the writing, as you say.
I think you have to know what you're not willing to negotiate away. There have to be some things, but that still leaves a lot up for grabs. Twitter is very useful in giving you sort of short, strong doses of what it's like to be in a world where everyone knows what they think all the time and are using it as a kind of combat to score one for the tribe. And if Twitter depresses you, or it bores you, or if it's an addiction you wish you could get rid of, then you know what it's like to know what you think all the time. And it's not a good state of mind. It's not interesting. And someone was asking if I'm on Twitter. I do not post on Twitter. I used to read Twitter a lot. In the last month or so, I've tried to go on the wagon. And I've, slipped off once or twice, but I feel better. My head is clearer without it. So I'm going to try to stay off Twitter. Back when it was very new, like in 2009, I think, or 2010, I wrote, "Twitter is crack for media addicts." And I think it may be the truest sentence I've ever written. I was roundly denounced as a Luddite and a technophobe, but I've seen people learn that the hard way.
Anna, you had your hand raised. I think we're almost out of time here, but
I have a quite long question, so I might save it for an email. Although I would be passing the mic to Roy, who is the master of long questions. So I don't know if mine could be here.
No, mine might be quick, which is given that desire to be in a place of kind of a correct amount of self-questioning, I'm curious how you feel about dialogue with readers in that regard. Like, you've written some opinionated things. My guess is you get drive-by criticism that's not well-intentioned, mixed in with lots of good dialogue. And so what makes good reader interaction for you from the reader side, and how do you treat it on the writer side?
Well, I love nothing more than an email, because I know that it's directed at me and not at the public. It's not a performance. They're not all gentle. Some of them can be pretty acerbic, but I always try to answer the ones that seem written in good faith. I think unless I just get a little overwhelmed with my inbox, I make sure to answer, and to answer thoughtfully, because people take time to write, and without readers, what are we? They're our customers. They're what we depend on. So I really like hearing from readers. Twitter is another matter, and I've had a recurring experience that's sort of amusing, where someone will write on Twitter, George Packer is a well-known segregationist or something like that. And I don't have a account to answer with, but if it's someone who I think I can find on email, I will find them and I will write to them and I will tell them, there's no basis for that. It's a lie. In fact, it's insulting. And you owe me a correction, and you should take it down, or you should correct it. And I swear to God, like 19 times out of 20, I immediately get an email back that says, "You're right. I'm really sorry. That was wrong. I was just tweeting kind of without thinking. I've taken it down, and I really admire your work." And it's like I become a human being. And suddenly, instead of this abstract, dartboard, and it sort of tells you what Twitter does to people. It dehumanizes both sides of that exchange, and but it's always a little bit reassuring to know that there's a human being on the other end of it too, and that person is capable of saying, "I was wrong. I've taken it down." It's just, why are you doing it in the first place is my question. Why are you obviously have intelligence, you have talent, you have a job, you have a profession. Why are so many professors and journalists spending so much time making, sort of debasing themselves by showing off and fighting and insulting and sucking up and on Twitter? I don't know. It's like, it's a weird drug that's taken over our media world. It will go away one day, but it's doing some damage in the meantime. Anyway, is that too depressing to end on? Is there something?
That was very helpful, actually, that people on Twitter have, right to apologize. That's the nicest thing I've ever heard anyone say about Twitter.
Yeah.
Although I have to add that on the last pages of Last Best Hope, when you say that people should just kill off their Twitter accounts, that was a little bit like Zizek. When Zizek comes and says, "Oh, everybody should become a communist and clean toilets," you're like, yeah, that's never going to happen. So you have to come up with something better, George, because you can't just go and tell people to kill off their Twitter accounts. That's not going to happen. We need an actionable plan.
Limit yourself to 45 minutes a day. Can we start there?
That's what Apple does. Yeah. You have an app that kicks you off after 45 minutes. Let's do that.
Okay.
Well, should we wrap it up there then? Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions and for participating. And of course, thank you so much, Anna, for arranging this, and not least George for taking 2 hours out of your day for this. This was fantastic.
Oh, I enjoyed it completely. And I'd asked Anna, you can't be serious, 2 hours, no one's going to want to sit for 2 hours. And she said, you don't know my group. And I have now gotten to know the group, and I'm really impressed.
We can keep going.
Yeah.
You will leave, and there will be the gossip about you now.
I'll be back as a guest for sure, Anna. Thank you. And Morten, thank you so much for being such a wonderful friend and reader. I hope to see you at a coffee shop soon.
Very, very soon. Very soon.
Moderated. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for coming. And this will go on YouTube, so you can continue in the comments there. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. And congrats, Morten.